call today's Zoning Board of Appeals meeting to order. Our first, our first order of business is to review and approve the minutes from the last meeting. I was at the last meeting. I'd be happy to move approval of the minutes.
I will second. I was also at the meeting.
Okay. Should we take a roll call vote or just
No, it's just.
a sound? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. I'm seeing no nay. So they have been approved. Okay.
And one thing to note, we didn't do roll call, it's not on the agenda. Probably want that for the minutes.
Okay, thank you. You're
Roll
right.
call.
All right.
All right. Dan Crowley,
Here.
Matthew Kolda,
Here.
Craig Stevenson,
Here.
Julia Potter,
Here.
Ron Coles.
Here.
Okay. Not our first agenda item, and appearing to be the only agenda item. Let's open the public hearing in consideration of variance VR 2329-19, request by Mary Beth Growney Celine, agent for Blackhawk Evangelical Free Church, Inc., to exceed the allowed 40 square feet of signage at 5935 Astor Drive, also known as Lot 1, CSM 1465. Time to swear them in.
Do you guys have the forms? The registration form?
Oh, I'm sorry.
You can swear them in all at once.
Okay.
I'll just read their first names.
Should I read them? Okay.
Yep.
Please raise your right hand and answer truthfully to the following oath. Do you, Mary Beth, Brownie Celine, Darren DeKaiser, and Mark Kautsky?
Mark was my father, but you can go with Matt.
Matt, my bad, Matt.
But he got the right.
You got the last name good, huh?
Thanks.
Good job.
Swear or affirm that the testimony you shall give in this hearing brought before the Zoning Board of Appeals of the City of Fitchburg, Wisconsin shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Yes, sir.
Very good. Do you give an overview, or do we start at? Okay, very good. It's your,
Can sit up here, you guys.
First of all, thank you
Thank you indeed.
You're welcome.
for the opportunity to talk and to convene this group of people together.
Thanks. Just making sure, I was gonna ask him if the microphone's picking up well for the three of you, but that's your mic.
This one? Great.
Okay, great.
There we go.
You must have heard me.
Got hand signals galore over there. I'd be careful he doesn't send any bad ones this way. So the variances, we kind of put it out there, is the conversation about the signage to go on the face of the church, which would be facing Seminole Highway. That has not been put up. You've probably driven past, or hopefully you've seen our site there. We do have new site signage, which is what was provided to you and is currently in front of you. That is all the monument signage that was brought out on site. Are there any questions, I guess, that maybe that we could answer first before we kind of, if you will, plead a case or kind of put forth an argument to you all that we can answer about the church, the site, our choices currently on site?
Why don't you put that out and then we'll question?
By all means. The church and the signage there that we have. We are proposing having a pretty much about a 50% bump or a little bit larger of overarching square footage. for the letters on the side of the building. The current zoning requirements allot us 40. As, you're floating through this, and I believe at the bottom you can see options A, B, and C. Apologies. There you go. Nope, take your time, please. Technology never works glorious for me. So first and foremost, I just wanted to bring to the attention of this committee what was provided to zoning, to planning, to design commission, and what was approved of just the exterior of the building. At that point in time, we fully acknowledged that as an item from the city staff, that signage was to be discussed at a later date and time, and in no way, shape, form, or another was this the approved signage for it. So we come into this with that full acknowledgement. The signage that's currently on that gets more closely to about I want to say, was it 90 to 100 square feet of overarching. Of course, that's an architect's view of what the signage should be, but he felt it was appropriate for that. As we scroll down in the pictures, thank you so much. B gives you a visual representation of what 40 square feet looks like. That is what the current zoning has out there. In our humble opinion, we look at that and say, well, on Seminole Highway, which is a highway where people can go quite fast, upwards of sometimes 55 miles an hour, depending upon the individual, and that having a setback well over 100 feet from the road, we felt that that almost looks a little too small, a little undersized for the building, especially in light of the development that is occurring to our west, whether that be Sub-Zero or the eventual Hop House. Both of those individuals will be able to abide by commercial zoning regulation, which puts them well over 200 square feet. As an organization, the church, we are proposing a bump to option C, which, is about 63 to 64 square feet. Feel that's a little bit more appropriate for the size of that wall. For those of you who haven't seen the building, that is a wood wall facing the church. I believe if you look in the packet that Mary Beth passed along, you can get an idea of what that kind of feels like from street view. I believe picture number 2 will give you the best.
2 and 3.
2 and 3, yep. We'll give you kind of the best view of it. And then you can kind of see where that's facing. From the church's perspective, our hope would be that this variance board would look at the sign and simply say, this isn't facing a residential street. It's not, hopefully not impacting any future developments. We're aware of the development to our south with Viridian Homes. Even if this were to impact them, it is facing the backs of all that homes or all those homes to an alleyway, which would be a lot of garages and just street traffic. So our overarching hope was that we were making a choice that would not impact them too negatively. Additionally, as you look at the site and the pictures that were just provided to you, we chose to do monument signage that did not actually go to the full maximum of the allotted amounts. Each one of those monument signs could have been about 40 square feet each on its sign face. We chose 6.6 and 4.8 appropriately as it related to those signs. Our hope was that if we were to have a sign on the building, that we would not just become the church of the flashing signs or the annoying signs. We understand that, we understand the ordinance, we understand the desire to keep things tasteful with that. Our main play in trying to have a larger sign here is to get the name out there and putting the name of Blackhawk as our organization. With having it a little bit larger, our hope is that it is seen and viewed and people are using that Seminole Highway entrance. If they shoot past it and they're relying on the monument signage on site, I think it might have the propensity to draw more traffic coming through the residential venue of Astor Drive, which I don't think, it's not our desire, nor should it probably be a lot of desires from folks here. We don't want to be a bad neighbor by any way, shape, form, or another. I realized in the variance request there were call-outs of Target, Staybridge Suites, and a couple other organizations that had requested a variance on signage, some of which had been approved and some of which had not been approved. I think just a couple of things from our purview. As it relates to all of them, a lot of them were requesting 100% bumps in signage. We are in no way, shape, form, or another requesting that, nor is our final desire of a little over 63 square feet anywhere near the initial amount allotted to each of those organizations as commercial properties. Yeah, so that's kind of our stance. Our big thing right now is truly just trying to be open and transparent and say that we wouldn't look at this as anything to try and add on to. It's just a sign with our name on the side of the building. And we would hope that it would be viewed as just abutting so much commercial property that it would afford us the opportunity to engage in this discussion a little bit further and possibly have it be that size. It's about all we've really come to prepare to discuss. And is there any questions that I can answer as it relates to the sign or
What will the
our
sign be
intention?
made of?
It'll be a channel letter, so made of aluminum, and it'll be illuminated from the back, so it'll create quote-unquote the halo effect. So it won't have light protruding out onto the street. It'll have blank metal faces, and it will be made in a dark bronze to match the existing building.
No, aluminum.
Oh, aluminum, sorry.
foot.
Yes, sir.
It might just quick append to Matt's comments. As we went through our architectural design review and whatnot, we knew signage was what it was just on as the architect's rendering. And the comments that we received from the council at the time was that they were happy with the design of the building, the look, and granted, they weren't speaking to signage in and of itself, but that was something that they had viewed, and there were no comments regarding signage at that time other than the staff comment about, you still would have to be within the ordinance and deal with something later on down the road.
If I have questions of the zoning, do I ask you?
Yeah, so I can go over the staff memo if
Okay.
there's no other questions at this time and kind of go over some of those.
Yeah, I do have a question. How would having a 40 square foot sign versus a 64 square foot sign prevent you from using the property for a permitted use? Because that's what you have to convince us of, at least initially, and then we have some other things to consider after that.
Okay.
But for this board, as I understand the rules, the law, is the first thing we have to find is that there is an unnecessary hardship. And that means the owner has to be prevented from using the property for a permitted use.
Okay.
So can anybody speak to that aspect of the difference in the proposed size signage versus what the law sets as the maximum signage?
So just sorry to interrupt quickly, but I think it might be helpful to go over all of those at once, because there might be, I guess, some additional things that are relevant to that kind of unnecessary hardship test.
Sure.
If that's okay, just so we don't get too far
Yep.
down one road. So it's okay with you, I'll just go briefly over the staff memo and we'll summarize. So I think that applicants have done a good job kind of explaining their request as it relates to the code. So they are requesting a approximately 64 square foot sign. However, in the zoning for the property is currently medium density residential, and in the medium density residential zoning district, permitted signage includes a sign erected by a church, school, or public body on its own grounds for its own purposes and not to exceed 40 square feet. And one thing to note there is that previous interpretations of the zoning code have determined that a church or public body or school can have more than one sign that's 40 square feet. It's just that any single sign cannot exceed 40 square feet. So that's, for example, why they have those other couple of signs that were approved at the entrances to the parking lot, which were less than 40 square feet. That's just one thing to note. So that's sort of the portions of the code that apply to this application. And then specifically when considering a variance request, there, as you are probably familiar, but I think it's been a little while since everyone has met. So I'm just gonna go briefly over the 3 tests that have to be applied to the variance request. So the first one, as Craig had mentioned, was, so for an area variance, which in this case we're considering an area variance. Unnecessary hardship exists when compliance would unreasonably prevent the owner from using the property for a permitted use or would render conformity with such restrictions unnecessarily burdensome. So that's just one thing I wanted to point out, is that sort of or statement that compliance would be unreasonably prevent the owner from using the property for a permitted use or would render conformity with such restrictions unnecessarily burdensome. And then just some additional guidance for that test specifically as provided by UW Extension in their Zoning Board of Appeals handbook, is that the courts have stated that unnecessarily burdensome may be interpreted in a different way depending on the purpose of the zoning law from which the variance is being sought. So when trying to consider that, you look specifically at the code. So in this case, for the sign ordinance, for example, the purpose of the chapter is to provide standards to safeguard life, health, and property, to eliminate hazards to pedestrians and motorists brought by distracting sign displays, to preserve and improve the appearance of the city, and to promote the public welfare by regulating and controlling the design, area, construction, location, and installation of all signs. So when you're thinking about the unnecessary hardship and whether or not there's an it's unnecessarily burdensome, those are things to consider. And in addition, when considering unnecessary hardship, you should consider the purpose of the zoning ordinance. So we just went over that. Its effect on the property in the short term and long term, and then the cumulative effects of granting that variance. So there's a kind of several elements, I guess, to unnecessary hardship.
Right.
And if you have any other questions, we can go back to that as discussion continues. So that's sort of the first test that you apply. The second test is unnecessary hardship due to unique property limitations. And so it must be due to physical limitations of the property, such as steep slopes or wetlands that prevent compliance with the code. And then the third one is no harm to public interest, which is a little bit more straightforward. And in this case, they have to meet all three of those tests in order to grant the variance. So it's just sort of some administrative items. And then we can also, in the staff memo, we provided the different sign variance applications that have come forth, whether or not they've been denied or approved. We can go over those if you'd like. And then the staff recommendation is that if the board finds the standards for variance to be met, it could approve the variance, and any action by the board needs to include a specific rationale for approving or denying the variance. So in this case, you're required to explain why you think it does or does not meet each of those tests, and then make a motion to approve or deny. And we do have a couple of just sort of standard conditions that we can go over at that point. That's all I have.
Very good. Nicely done. How long ago was this platted? Because it was in corn about a year ago. Or not platted, but in zoned.
Oh, it doesn't
Has
feel
always
like
been?
It's been zoned for this for a while. I think they might know a little bit more about the history, specifically when the church was built and approved, but it's been a residential use for several years, yeah.
We broke ground about.
October 2018.
Yes.
October 2018 or so, right around.
Okay.
So you can count back from there from the design and
Sure.
the approvals that go. So about April, March, that we really put forth a lot of these designs and
Right.
things.
I mean, when I look at unnecessary hardship, but also your amendment, the or, imagine any church could operate without a sign, but, you need to tell people who you are and why you're there. I think you're probably pretty destinational, so many people coming to your church know where you are, but as opposed to, if I'm driving down the street and I see Bob's shoes, I might say, well, I'll run in and get some mucklucks, but I'm not likely to go by and say, I think I'll run in and save my soul.
To that point in time, I would kindly call how we use our buildings. While we absolutely operate as a church, there's no qualms. There's a giant cross on the side of this thing.
Right.
We're never going to call away from that. We actively are a community partner, whether it be through locally here, Bradger Prairie Needs Network, the Verona Area School District, or any other local partners that I'm forgetting to mention. When we look at how we use our current site in Middleton, we host over 4,000 events a year. of those 4,000 events, over 40% of those exist as outside people, whether that be a polling place, whether that be a training session, JDRF, Juvenile Diabetes Research Foundation, Boys and Girls Club, Boy Scouts. We are a community center, and that is one of our primary and founding goals. If you go to our website, our goal in owning buildings is not to say, wow, we own a building. It is to make this building available to all people in the neighborhood. So to the idea of harm or inability to effectively do what we're doing, I will not argue that on Sunday morning people won't land at our place. There's no argument that I can make to this board that would not be laughable to that end. But what I can say, our usage throughout the week. We intend for this building to be a 24/7 site again. Right now we're keeping limited hours just because we just opened. We're trying to figure out and get our sea legs with us. But our intentions is that this is open to the public for public use and rental for what that's worth. And the inability to have something that can keep people from avoiding using the Astor Drive, especially when coming from the south to the north, I think that is pivotal. And I think there is a possibility, how you choose to interpret that possibility or probability of harm to people crossing Astor or increased traffic to a residential neighborhood. It's not our goal nor our desire to actually impact the neighborhood with an extra 20, 40, or even 15 pieces of traffic. It would be to try and push that traffic as much as possible through our entrances and our way of that entrance on Seminole Highway. So I can't say that there's imminent doom, but I would hope that I could cast a reasonable shadow of doubt, as we don't want to burden the neighborhood. We don't want to overload a street that was never intended to hold 50 cars in 10 minutes. We want to be the good steward and have that traffic come through. The failure to have a sign that is appropriately done on that, if this board says, well, you're probably stuck at 40 square feet, I'm going to be brutally honest, we're going to probably have to rethink our approach on how we're doing signage. And that's not meant to be any ounce of threat. That's just to say, if we can't get something there, we have to rethink of how we're branding and doing this, because we view that as how do we get people into this building as Blackhawk. So I'm sorry, it looks like you're raising a question.
So there's no similar request for a sign on the north end of the building visible to southbound traffic. All we have would be these monument signs.
Correct. Given the not a large amount of square footage available, we're not even proposing that at this specific time. We fully acknowledge that there is 40 square feet, and we were trying to play in a sandbox. In a dream world, might there be an opportunity for that? Great. That might be something we should look at, but not until we could have this meeting to have a dialogue to even see if that's a possibility. We view a lot of our traffic coming from the Verona area. We view a lot coming from the outskirts, whether it be Oregon, Brooklyn, so on and so forth. So, in a dream world, would we have something on that side? Yes, but given the ordinance as it stands today, we couldn't in good conscience use our square footage that way. We felt it most appropriate to go on this side, but open to dialogue of that as well.
And I would just piggyback on one other thing here, is that what 40 or 60 square feet, yeah, I understand that, but what makes this building, because that's not the church is the people, but what makes that building different than other buildings is, hopefully we see this as, that's an eternity building. There's no 3-month or 3-year lease, there's no 10-year lease. That building should be there for a long time. And when we invest in a sign, whatever size, and hopefully it would be 64 square feet, that sign is going to be there for, we haven't replaced the one at Brader Way in Middleton yet, but when we do, it's gonna go on that building again, because that building is staying there, and that's where a church comes to worship. So that might be a nuance.
In the design of the building, you talked about the architecture. Did any of you, were any of you present for some of the discussions about the design of the building? I'm not talking about the signage, I'm just talking about the overall aesthetic.
Yeah.
of the building.
Exactly.
And is it, to some extent, the design of the building, especially in contrast to what I understand is around it? I mean, there's no sign on that now, and I can tell it's a church. It's the only church on that stretch of the road. And how tall is this building?
33 feet, just
30.
shy of it to the top.
Okay, and so, and there's a cross erected on the face
Yes, sir.
where the sign's gonna go. So isn't it, I mean, to me, this looks like a church whether you put the sign on it or not. It could be, is this a different church than Black Hawk? I mean, as it stands now, it's not obvious that it's Black Hawk Church unless you see the masthead signs as you approach. But I think the idea that I'm looking at this is that it's been designed aesthetically to look like, in a modern sense, a church. Is that right?
Well, the architect would like to hear you say that.
Yeah, I mean, I can,
I mean,
I know the area pretty well, and I've seen it go up, and I thought, oh, this is a very, but it's a church. I knew it before I heard about it. But, I mean, to me, the whole aesthetic and appearance of the exterior of the building says, I'm a church. Is that fair?
I think that's a very fair assessment, and I think that's very astute. And I think, like Mary Beth said, our architect would be doing cartwheels in the back of this room with that comment right now. But I think one of where we're kind of standing from is also looking at this overarching site, looking at Sub-Zero putting up 100 and some odd thousand square foot building that will be pretty beautiful, and I think will deter from what is now currently a very vacant plot of area. Then the addition of a hop house that would be there, the light that would be shot off from those parking lots, their signage, their buildings, will deter from the driver that's coming along on that road. Again, I appreciate the comments. I think it's very fair, but I think if we look at the entire stretch of Seminole Highway at 50 miles an hour and all the things that are going up, and if we're going to throw 100 and some odd Viridian homes just in front of that, I think the prettiness and the fact that we're sitting alone right now is going to start to diminish. And as Darren said, we're in it for the long haul and not for right now. We are looking to say, what does this look like 1 year, 10 years down the road when this is developed, and the plantings that are put out
We're
front.
making the assumption Seminole is going to expand. There is going to be more traffic as well, so get whatever speed limits exist then. So this is a long-term discussion.
So is there gonna be development south of the church? I'm looking at this
Yep.
map here with Astor to the north, is that right?
Yes.
Is this church-owned property, this
All
parcel?
of that, yes.
Okay, so how many, and this is the
We're
site?
down to here. We're down to here with the parking. So this is a green space.
I got it, okay.
What page are you on?
I'm sorry, I'm on page 10 of the 20. Looking at the shaded blue, or,
Yep,
yeah,
you're
that,
on.
it's rotated in my version, but that's the,
So the homes to the south, I mean, Sonia, you might have a much better feel for how many are going there, but
117.
there you go. Sorry,
How many?
117. And to the best of my knowledge, that was minimal gaps and all an alleyway behind it.
Small lots, alley loaded, and then those would occur south of the blue parcel.
Correct.
okay. And I count about 7 lots that abut your parcel to the east.
Yep.
Off of Leo Mary Street, okay. So that gives me some understanding of how big that parcel is.
It's just under 10 acres.
The sign you said is going to be how many feet away from the road? Cars driving down?
We abide by all setbacks of 30 plus 10 for the sidewalk. As it stands right now, if you go from the shortest distance, let's play that, that's about 40 feet, but that doesn't get anyone anywhere. What I'm arguing on a distance is the point of the edge of the building to the entrance of our driveway, which is what the picture is on picture 2 and 3 of what Mary Beth handed out. That's well into the 150 to 200 foot range at that specific juncture. So, does that answer your question?
And I'm gonna ask this question, I know the answer, but for anybody that doesn't know the area well, this is almost a flat, perfectly flat grade at,
We brought in a lot of fill.
Yeah.
right, but I mean, the general lay of the land is it's not.
Yeah, you would look at it and go, oh, that's flat.
Yes.
And I ask that because I wasn't at the meeting, but apparently that was a consideration in another variance request like this, where some difference in elevation vis-a-vis the thoroughfare was considered, but I don't think anybody's suggesting that it would be just what goes up around it, but it's flat landscape and flat to the road.
And, I mean, yeah, the other question is there gonna be a light, is there gonna be a stop sign? How,
Right.
what is the turn lanes, what does that all look like as it relates to Sub-Zero Parkway, as it relates to whatever potential expansion of Seminole Highway is or is not in any near future?
About how many acres is that parking lot covered to the south?
Oh, golly.
I mean, that's 2/3 of the site, isn't it?
I think that's a very fair assumption, I don't.
What is the acreage on all the parking?
Yeah. I mean, I see it wraps around a little bit. Sorry, I'm on page 18 now.
Yeah.
But that's 2/3 of the site to the south is covered in the parking lot, roughly.
I think for the
Yeah.
argument's sake of what you're saying,
We
yeah, I
have,
think
we have under 7 acres usable to begin with because of all the setbacks.
Yeah, okay.
And water, so the parking might be.
4, yeah.
In the current setback on Seminole Highway, because of the easements, or I should say not the setback, but the easements are 31 feet.
The roadway easements.
The roadway easements on Seminole.
I know the one, I wanted to say, on the Stay Bridge, then that was, but I also think here, having a sign that can be seen from the four corners, et cetera, is probably the same kind of thing we issued, that we worked with in Stay Bridge to get them, visibility. And I know having your name up is important. I'm sure part of your mission is proselytizing, and having people go by and see your church is probably a big part of that mission, or some of the part of that
Yes,
mission.
we'd like to think we're different, and I know everybody says that, but I think Blackhawk has a brand. Hopefully, some of you, all of you have heard of who we are, not about what the church is, but who we are and what we do for the community. And we like to broadcast that, to say that we're here, that we're present, to be a part of this community and to come alongside of whatever it is we can. Whether it be with the City of Madison with the Mifflin Street Block Party cleanup. Annually, we do Love Madison, which is a full day of service to all of our community partners. So, that exists for
And there
that.
is a bit of, is it a destination where people are going? Yes, but that also might be something that they drove by, and if they're driving by 50 miles an hour, are they seeing the monument signs? Are they seeing the Black Hawk? Are they distracted by other signage? But we've had people come to the Middleton site because they've driven by so many times and they see Black Hawk. You can Google it, of course, or some have come in a funny way because there's a parking structure behind our building in Middleton. And I want to go to a church. I want to see what that's like with it because there's a parking structure there. So there's a little bit about, oh, it's Black Hawk. I can figure that out. So.
And I understand and appreciate all that. I guess the difficulty I have is the way we're asked to interpret these requests. We have to start with, and the words that are used are, to me, it's a pretty big obstacle. Unnecessary hardship or unnecessarily burdensome. Is it a hardship? I certainly think you could argue that it is, in terms of thinking about what the church's purpose is or what its mission is. But you would agree that you have other methods of outreach, I'm sure, than the sign on the side of your building. I'm sure you communicate with the community in lots of ways. Some of the things you described, I got a mailing in my box in the last week or so, and I'm sure there's lots of other things that I'm not aware of. And certainly the use of the property, one aspect is to let the community know you're there. Physicality, the nature of the building, as I mentioned earlier, does some of that. But it certainly doesn't impede what goes on inside the building, or the ability to conduct services or the community functions that you envision taking place in there. I don't think that's you know, the issue here. So there might be some measure of hardship, there might be some measure of burden, but is it unnecessary hardship, unnecessary burden? And that's where I'm, you know, I guess I feel it's sort of my duty to say, well, at some point the municipal code got written and they picked 40 feet. Why? I don't have the foggiest idea why. It's not really my job to guess, but they must have had something in mind. You heard some of the preamble about, you know, what these sign ordinances are supposed to do. But it, you know, it always gives me pause to second guess, you know, what the municipal code says. And, you know, I think there are, I mean, these are all close calls, I think, but I think from the aesthetic of the building, the lay of the land, and there's, you know, it kind of stands out in my view. Now, of course, there's going to be more houses there, but, you know, is there anything else that you haven't said that would speak? I mean, I'm hearing it would be a preference to have a bigger sign, and that's the case in almost every one of these we see. Everybody wants to get their message out there, whether it's for, you know, noble community purposes or commercial purposes. Everybody would like to have a bigger presence, I think, when they come into one of these, and I appreciate and understand that. But the code says it's supposed to be 40 feet, and to get past that, we have to find an unnecessary hardship or burden. Is there anything else along those lines that?
I think you made a very careful distinction of, would the sign prevent us from our staff being able to do their job in the space? I think the answer is no. But if there's nobody coming into the space, that's where we're seeing a fundamental challenge. Yes, you can make an argument that a 6 square foot sign might bring somebody into the space, but when they come into the space angry, and when they come into the space jaded because they weren't able to find the building in the appropriate way, or they got turned around in a wandering neighborhood, I think that would be where I might try to appeal to your senses of maybe an undue burden. Because when people come into our church, come into our buildings, I don't care if it's Target or us, they're coming in with a chip on their shoulder. That's always a hard burden to overcome. When we look at the customer experience, or any organization looks at the customer experience, it doesn't start in your building. It starts outside. What did it take to get here? What did it take to get in? And I would say there is a burden placed upon the church if we aren't getting people in the appropriate fashion and way, that I think would hope on some level some of you might see that a little bit larger of a sign, nothing grandiose or large. We're not pushing Las Vegas or even Wisconsin Dells for that matter. We're pushing a humble request to just help our people get in and to make our process a little bit smoother so then they come in, they are of a clear mind and not frustrated from that experience of having to wander. I know that's semantics on some level, so I don't wish to make a sob case, but that would be where I would take your question a little more directly.
We also design based upon the person who's unchurched, the person who's seeking to come. The reality is, the person who's come to a church before typically knows what to expect and what to look for. Someone who's new to this, we want them to be completely at ease coming in. I would say, you know, the uniqueness, what is the unique factor? I could come back to, this is a cornerstone of being in the community. This isn't a 5-year lease. It is in competition with other structures and other signage, and we also look at it from an aesthetic standpoint, just pure aesthetics. The people who know aesthetics and design initially designed it a certain way, and that's what felt right, and that's why we turn also to Ryan Signs. Like, what does Ryan Signs feel is appropriate based upon the fact that this is their livelihood? And I know Mary Beth's probably not wanting to talk much because does she want to sell more sign? But that's not what she's trying to do, is upsell a sign. But I don't know all of your careers, but I know what his was and currently is, and I know what hers is. And these are the authorities in the room to speak to aesthetics and wanting something great for the community as well, and just makes sense and fits.
Well, but unfortunately, the code has told us what the city feels makes sense, and that's 40 square feet. And
But
I-
when is there a church next to a 100 and some thousand square foot sub-zero facility next to a brew house? So that's the corner that got developed, and that's what I'm just.
Let me ask you a different question, though. So is it your contention that having a 24 square foot larger sign will cause people approaching from the south to understand that they need to turn right before the parking lot?
Correct.
Yes. So with
How
anything,
does that extra 24 feet accomplish that?
ability to view, first and foremost. At the 40 square foot,
Yeah, that's okay.
Sorry, at 40 square feet, when you look at that particular picture, the actual viewing distance of that standing still is roughly in the neighborhood of about 200 to 300 feet away from it. Okay, that's standing still. Let's put that at 50 miles an hour, which is what the posted speed limit is. Let's be real and call it 55. And the ability for somebody to see that after the Viridian development is made in roughly a span of, if we're looking at this, let's even call it acres, of 2 to 3 acres. Boom, they got to see that. And they got to see that when they're coming up to an intersection, when they're coming up to large buildings that, again, beautiful buildings. I applaud the city for having Sub-Zero create a building that is going to be as pretty as it is. But that is going to deter from what we're at. And we want to be able to get out in front of it, not from a pompous or a we're here first, it's just to help them come in. I know the easy counter argument that could be made as well, that's only taking 50% of your traffic. Correct. I won't deny that, but we're just trying to play well and say that we are only pushing this one side and that one portion of it. So.
Is another option to address that and not step on the toes of the code to increase the size of the masthead sign that's near that entrance? And my understanding is there is some room to do that, or am I mistaken?
That sign could be 10 times larger than it is. It's not quite 10 times.
However,
But it
to
was-
the end of getting people in ahead of time, it's not because
Right.
it's not going to do it. You have to have that out in front. Why does, when you drive down the highway, things are way out in front of you. You got to see them, because if you see them at the actual entrance, most highway exits are not going to occur within 100 foot. You're not going to slam on the brakes and pull to the right. Some do, but most are going to need to have that visual cue. With any marketing pieces, it's the rule of 3. You got to get out in front of them a handful of times before they can actually make the adjustment to their purchase, to their choice pattern, as it were, and relates to that.
You know, one part of the variance process is that the code is the code. And so if this isn't meeting code, it has to be a variance. This happens in a lot of the different things that we've looked at. I was saying before, we had one with, over on Sprocket, with driveways and roads so that the trucks could get through. The city had no problem with it, but it didn't state that in the code, so we needed to have a variance. I somewhat see the same thing with you wanting the size of the sign and good look of the sign for people to recognize you, and very much like the stay bridge, which was tucked in the back, and really their sign was increased for them to get the visibility so people knew where to go. And I do see something of an unnecessary burden there. And I will also note that I think at the end of our memo, it says the city would not object if we were to approve the variance.
Oh, I'm sorry, did I not see that?
Well, I should clarify, it's up to the zoning board of appeals to make the determination just based on the facts provided by staff. So in this case, staff can't issue variances and can't formally
Correct.
recommend or not.
Correct.
Well, I'm sorry, what is the comment, though, that the city has a position on this or doesn't?
City staff has not made a recommendation or taken a position, since the zoning board of appeals has to make a decision in the hearing based on the sort of facts presented to it on how they meet the hardship criteria or not.
Okay, so the city's, I mean, again, I think the city speaks through the municipal code. I think the city has told us what its position is, and our question is whether or not to deviate from that. I always assume that bodies of government make decisions through deliberative processes. Whether that actually happens or not, I don't know. But, you know, somebody got together at some point and maybe they got some experts, or maybe they talked to people in other cities, or I'm not quite sure, but you can imagine the kind of things that a city would go through to decide, you know, where are we gonna draw these boundaries. You know, at times they seem a little bit arbitrary, and quite frankly they are, but they have to be respected because of where they come from. And that's why I'm always cautious. I mean, if somebody were to bring, you know, something to say that, you know, there should be, this number should be larger, or there should be exceptions if it abuts a commercial zone. I mean, this is in and of itself is an exception to the absolutely no sign in residential zoning rule. Does everybody understand it? That as far as I know, you can't have a sign at all in a residentially zoned, but there's an exception made for schools and churches, provided that they're within the 40 feet. So what we're actually dealing with here in some ways is an exception to the no sign rule, and that's, at least as I understand it, why it's much smaller than a commercial sign rule, which is in a place or a zone where you would find signs on everything. So you're allowed to have the sign at 40 feet, and I think we have to respect that decision unless we find a really significant issue.
Dan?
Oh, I was gonna ask, subdivision signs in residential neighborhoods, you know, like, those are permitted, is that correct?
So a subdivision sign is also limited to 40 square feet.
Very good. Does anybody else on the board have questions, or?
One thing that, this is what it is, but just as background, and we had no problem, we said, yes, let's do that then. We presented a plot like this to begin with the building on the northwest corner, because we felt the city would want the building on the northwest corner. We also would have said, well, boy, the southeast corner, if we could just put it back there and shoot out to the north where people are coming in off of McKee. The conversation on signage, we'd probably be here today again, because we would say, well, if we want something on the building to cast all the way to that intersection of Astor and Seminole, it's gotta be bigger than 40 square feet, I'm guessing. So we built intentionally because we knew the city would want it to be a cornerstone there, and we said, let's just start there. Let's not screw around.
One undue burden to put out there. It's not an undue burden, but it's a costly burden. Let's say we were to put a 40 square foot sign sitting at that main entrance. Let's say we were to do it in letters, not unlike which are currently on the building. That would require 3 transformers, 3 runs of power, which would mean the power that is currently out there at 120 volt would not suffice for it. It'd be 277. We would have to pull up our entire parking lot. We'd have to drill and core. It is currently winter. That doesn't occur cheaply. Let's say we wait. We've got probably an expense somewhere in the neighborhood.
We already have buried costs in the wall
Yep.
that exists, figuring we're gonna put a sign up there.
And to put we could do a 40 square foot sign. Let's play that card. We're talking about an added expense to the organization well over $15,000 to get the power appropriately out there and buttoned into the building in the correct manner. That's a burden to a nonprofit organization.
You're talking about if you increase them.
If we increase the size on that, the standard power that's sitting there to light a very simple internally illuminated sign is different than that of a set of channel letters that would be stating Blackhawk. That would probably require about 3 specific transformers. I'm going off of what we use in our current building. I'm making some assumptions. I'm not trying to falsify what's there, but it requires a different type of electric than currently exists. That is an added cost to that electric. It is new conduit runs. We can't run them in what is currently there. That incurs a cost of running conduits through the parking lot. So yes, a bigger sign could be put there in the event that this variance hearing states that we shouldn't have more square footage on our building. The costs associated with that are rather large to a organization that sells nothing.
But are you saying that you chose the size of the masthead sign based on the assumption that the variance would be granted and you'd have a bigger sign on your building?
We hoped that it would show a goodwill. We hope that it, as an organization, if we chose a smaller sign, it would feel more appropriate to have a little bit larger of a sign on a building. In no way are we trying to say one is preceding the other. We're trying to show a good faith gesture that we don't want to have 3 additional signs on site with 40 square feet. That'd be 120 total square feet plus another 40 on the building. That just feels really, that didn't feel good to us aesthetically, but that probably wouldn't feel very good to anyone sitting here in front of us. So we were trying to do, we made an assumption, and we were trying to be polite with our assumption. Yes, sort of we did, but it wasn't to try and be, try to force your hand. It's to say we were trying to be the polite, good steward that we could.
Maybe this is a question for city staff. Is there any limit to the number of signs that a single parcel or institution can have? Is it 40 in the aggregate, or is it, you could put 10 signs up, 40 square feet each? Does anybody know the answer?
So I think in the code, the way that it's written for residential uses, it said it's typically always said that a church can have a 40 square foot sign, and in the past, so every other church in Fitchburg has a 40 square foot sign. And then the determination was made by zoning staff a few years ago that you could have more than one 40 square foot sign, but a single sign could not exceed 40 square feet. I don't think that, so for commercial businesses, we limit all signage to 150 square feet per code. So that's sort of like a standard, I guess, for the maximum signage that would be permitted.
You said zoning staff made the decision?
So the zoning administrator is allowed to make interpretations of the zoning code, and I don't have the email with me on I guess, to show for the record, but former staff had indicated that the interpretation was that we would allow more than one 40 square foot sign for churches or schools or public bodies. And that interpretation could change, but the preference is always to try to be consistent with those kinds of decisions.
Okay.
Okay, go ahead.
And we specifically asked for an interpretation on that. Could I, Dan, do you mind if I continue to speak? If I could, Craig, go back to a comment that you made about just the ordinance in general. We as a company work with a lot of municipalities and ordinances. And I can tell you, as hard as every single community works, there is not one ordinance out there that covers every single possible situation. And so variances are kind of a part of the creature. And Sonia and I have had extensive conversations about this over the last many months. And I don't know that anyone could have anticipated in writing the code and the Fitchburg sign ordinance that we would be talking about having a church on Seminole Highway where the speed limit is 50 miles an hour. When we included in our packet the remainder of the churches in the city of Fitchburg, and with the exception of the one that is on McKee, they're all completely surrounded by residential. They are either at 32 or somewhere between 32 and 40 square feet, all of them. I guess the one on Fish Hatchery is across the street from residential. But a couple of them are just tucked right in neighborhoods, which, thank goodness for GPS, because I would never have found them otherwise. But I guess my point is, the variance process is not a unique part of any ordinance. It's how they're handled in different municipalities. Varies. But there's no single ordinance that can address every single possible scenario.
Well, yeah, and, you know, when we convene and we do hear about things like, you know, if we don't permit a variance for a driveway to be wider, the truck will have to swing into the right lane of a two-lane in the single direction. And, you know, I do hear things like that. We have occasionally a crooked lot line in the corner of something dips over the 11 feet of setback, and it's just you know, it really defeats an entire remodel because a few inches of the point of a building. And you know, I completely agree that the variances give this board the flexibility to address things like that, where the functionality of the property starts to be an issue if we don't give a little bit on the rules that the code sets forth. It just, on some of these signage issues, though, it's a little more difficult for me to see it in those terms, in terms of unnecessary hardship and unnecessary burden. But I think I've already talked too much today, so I'm gonna let people talk.
To Craig's point, the one part that I struggle with is what is unique about this property as opposed to anybody else who would like to have a larger sign and could design a similar building on a perfectly flat piece of property, right? The idea of the variance is there's something special about your case, that because of the property limitations, because of some hardship that's not self-imposed, we need to treat you differently in order essentially to treat you equitably with everybody else. And that's what I struggle with. I hear a little bit about, you know, what the planned development in the surrounding property is. Is there any other unique physical element of the property that we can point to here that's connected to that hardship that gives rise to that?
Yeah, I think Mary Beth kind of hit on it. No other church sits on a 50-mile-an-hour road. Highway by nature of its labeling. And I think that is the uniqueness of this. As it relates to any of the other churches listed out here, we're dealing with Lacey, Fitchburg, excuse me, Fish Hatchery Road, and I apologize, McKee. Even though McKee can get to 40, we still hold differently. I would also make the argument that the one on McKee is not surrounded by very large buildings, not 100,000 square foot anything. So I would say the nature of it all is we are on a unique road. We are on a highway. The rate of speed is substantially different than that of any other church listed here. I don't know of all the churches in Fitchburg, so I won't make that brash statement. But what we have in terms of the information, that would be our unique player. And then to that end, yeah, I'll just leave it at that. I'm sorry. Apologies.
Well, and again, I look at the pictures of the churches, and I'm reminded that church buildings have a distinguishing architecture all their own in many cases, not all of them. But, you know, you could see a sort of a big box store. You take one sign down, you put up another, and you know, the purpose or the brand changes, but a church just sort of always looks like a church and will always be a church. I think the aesthetic of the building communicates a great deal to the community on its own, and I think that's something that was well considered when you met with an architect or chose an architect and that architect developed design, was we don't want to create a rectangle in this field. We want to create something that both internally for the function we envision, but also outwardly and aesthetically communicates to everyone who sees it, this is a place of community and a place of worship. And so I think there is some communication in the architecture. I think a lot of architects would like to hear people say that.
They would. They would.
And so I think you have to, and when I think about this is I think about there's a lot of things that communicate to the community what's there. There's the outreach you do in the community, there's the mailings, there's any other media you access, and there's the physicality of your building itself and the signage on it and around it. And you're given a lot of tools to communicate, and I think you're using them to the maximum, which is great. But I also, it makes me wonder whether we need to give on this issue because of some of the other things I mentioned. So that's, I'm kind of looking at it in that way.
Let me ask, if you saw this building, I'm gonna ask you, and it had no sign on it, would you know if it was a mosque, a temple, a Catholic church? I'm looking here at Memorial United, it's the next one, Memorial United Church of Christ, and they have a 40-foot sign, but it's actually two-sided. And I believe in City of Madison, that would be an 80-foot sign.
Correct.
But you know that it's the United Church of Christ. And I think if there's burden here, I think it's just visibility to make the statement who you are. But I will leave it at that.
And we don't consider the cross, I mean, that's correct, right? That is independent. I mean, that does clearly communicate something. It doesn't communicate and distinguish you from other Christian denominated houses of worship. But there is a cross on the building, and it's quite tall. I can't tell, I think it's 24 feet tall.
It is.
So they didn't need a sign permit.
Right.
Yeah.
That's free speech and all that. We respect that.
The other distinction between all of the other churches, and Dan just spoke to it, is they all prominently have the name of the church on the sign. With the Black Hawk project, even though we have Black Hawk on the signs, we really focused on the wayfinding element. And going back to the Staybridge Inn variance approval, one of the things that we really are trying to do here is self-regulate or self-limit, as Matt and Darren have both said, to really encourage members of the community to be using the Seminole Highway driveway and minimize the amount of traffic that's going down Astor. And again, the 50% increase may not seem like a lot, but when you look at the signs side by side, the sign sizes side by side, there is a distinct difference in presentation, scale on the building, and readability from a 55-mile-per-hour highway. And I think there's a lot to be said for what the church is trying to do here. We had to have the two driveways. I mean, that was clearly part of the development. But if I lived off of Astor Drive, I would be really happy that the church was trying to focus the traffic off of Seminole.
Do any of the members, Ron or Matthew, do you have any questions or thoughts?
I think of it just, I was a member of the board during the Staybridge, that was just more of a case of being, visibility from like PD and from Verona Road. It was quite a more distance from like the main roads, whereas this church is, taking the setbacks into account, like right on Seminole. So I guess I'm just having a hard time thinking that it'll be that hard for someone looking at the 40, square foot sign to figure out, where to turn, especially if you're coming, going north, then if you're coming south, I mean, you're going by the monument signs anyway.
Ron?
Well, my initial thought when I looked at the materials that were presented, the scale issue came up as far as the sign and in terms of the face of the building, the face of the wood part of the building where the sign would go, and the rest of the frontage, the elevation off of the highway. That was one thing that caught my eye. And in fact, this is a unique situation. They're on a highway. They got neighbors on the other side of the road that are not residential. They are large, huge buildings as compared, they're large buildings as compared to the church, and they are going to become a distraction for people as you're coming down. I can tell you, I live 8 blocks from here, and I drive this every day. And I can tell you that when the church went up, that was the focus, because it was all that was there. Now that the Sub-Zero building is going up, when I'm driving down, my focus of attention is on that building, even though it's under construction, and once it's done, and with its lighting and its signage, it clearly is gonna become an element that's gonna distract the driver, I think, from focusing on the church and trying to find the church and get to the entrance that the church wants and that I think the city wants. So, I mean, I think this is a unique situation that I have some very strong feelings for that. I think that, you know, I think you've made a case here, and this is a unique location on a highway, and you're gonna have competing, I don't want to call them distractions, but you're gonna have competing other buildings and signage that are going to pull the driver's attention away from the church.
Julia? Okay.
If I may, I'm sorry, I can't see.
Oh,
That's Ron
Ron.
Rollins.
I apologize. One thing to that end, for somebody who doesn't know Blackhawk or just looks this up, our building in Middleton is about the size of Sub-Zero. And to somebody who's making a brash, or not a brash, but a quick, oh, they have a large building, the argument could easily be made in their head, that's a really pretty large building there. There's no reason that that can't be the church, because we have something that looks like that currently. I won't disregard the fact that there's a cross on one building and there's not a cross on the other, but I would appeal to you to have the understanding that we're not far off in square footage from that with our regular campus. We don't want to do that here. That's not the intention. But if that's somebody's perception of us, we have to be careful and we have to be cognizant of that we're appropriately labeling. I think one thing to also note is, look at outside right now. What time is it? We spend a lot of our winter in the dark and in the morning hours in the dark. When we open this building up for services on Sunday morning, it's dark out. What can we communicate, and how does the sign size affect that communication in those hours and those times when signage is actually even more crucial than daylight hours when somebody can see the cross? The cross is not illuminated at all. So at nighttime, that cross is gone.
Is the Blackhawk gonna be illuminated?
Yes, it will.
It's backlit.
Can I ask you a funny question?
Go ahead.
This is gonna sound strange, though. Why did you make the request for the 64 feet shown in item C, page 14, instead of the almost 90 feet in item D? That's sort of the go big or go home question. You know, what were the considerations that went into sort of splitting the difference between, because I've seen the 40 square foot, and is the 90 kind of what the architect recommended?
Correct.
Okay,
Correct.
can you just tell me where you came up with the middle ground and how that particular size of 63.45 was arrived at versus the 89?
A couple of things. Number one, reasonableness. And number two, we felt that the visibility and the readability of the 30-inch letters would meet our needs.
So we're talking about 35 versus 30 versus
30.
almost 24.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so it's about a 5-6 inch step down at each.
Right. Right.
I know this is going to sound a little odd, but a church saying that they're 42,000 square feet, we don't want to be too ostentatious with the sign. I think that is a lot of consideration with it. Yeah, we do want our name out there. The go big or go home is absolutely something, but we don't want to be the church with the largest sign in Dayton County either. We want to try and find that middle ground to meet where hopefully all parties would feel that there was a victory.
Yeah. This has nothing to do with that decision, but we actually had conversations of, do we put a cross on the building? So there's a lot of intentionality to many of our decisions that we just don't assume. So, yeah, for what that's worth.
We're at a point where we will entertain motions.
Just a reminder that 4 votes are required to approve.
Okay. They don't get to vote.
I'm happy to vote.
I would argue that there is an undue hardship based on visibility, based on the speed of the road, based on the distance. I would also say that it would not harm the public interest because it is on a major road with commercial across the street. And when I say unnecessary hardship, we're talking about a sign as opposed to, a building. And I think the unnecessary hardship is to say that it's best to be visible. I think the last point you made about driving down Seminole Highway in the dark is valid. And I would make a motion that we approve the variance.
I would second it.
And are we gonna discuss further or deliberate, or what do we do next?
I think everything's on the table. Anything?
Well, and I'll just comment on the motion that's on the table. I don't think the owner of the property is unreasonably prevented from using the property for its permitted use. And I think that conformity with the sign restriction is not unnecessarily burdensome. That doesn't mean I don't think that this is a good idea or that I don't see the merit in the issues that have been presented. I actually tend to agree with a lot of them. But we start with an ordinance, and then we've got these words that have been used that allow us to overcome that. And I think that this church has shown itself very able and willing to find creative and thoughtful ways to communicate with the community, and it will be able to fulfill its mission and its purpose and use the property that it's selected and built on for those uses with the sign within the bounds that the ordinance sets forth. So that's my comment on the pending motion.
Okay.
Can I just make one more comment too, to jump on top of that? The fact that there are options to put multiple 40 square feet signs other places on the property cuts against the idea in my mind that we've got, unnecessarily burdensome conformity. It's a little bit more expensive to have multiple signs, but I don't think that we've got a code here that's created no practical option for you to direct people to the parking lot safely on the road. And so I also agree. I think, aesthetically, I prefer what you guys prefer. I prefer that from the public safety, public interest perspective, but I really have a hard time seeing how we get over this, unnecessary hardship that's unique to this particular property. That's where I struggle here.
All right.
I ask a question, because there is some lack of clarity on the amount of signs afforded to us. If they were at 40 square feet, would the city of Fitchburg be amicable to, if there were multiple 40 square foot signs, would they be amicable to a total square footage of 3 or 4 of them at that side, putting the overarching square footage at 120 to 100 and, gotcha.
I'm going to say I don't think it's really germane to this appeal.
And that's a tangential line, just as a question for us as we hear what you're all saying. I'm just curious if anyone has an opinion on that.
I'm not sure we can, I don't know.
I don't know if you can comment.
Yeah,
I mean, you
because
cannot
that's
comment.
I don't think we can
I
weigh in on
apologize,
that.
yeah.
Nope,
It's
not in the
just-
least.
Somebody's gonna have to figure that out for you.
Okay, not a problem. I just thought I'd at least.
Yeah, no,
See if somebody-
I appreciate the question.
One clarification that I had was in the or part of the or would render conformity with such restrictions unnecessary burdensome. Did I take that wrong when you mentioned, does aesthetics possibly fall within that, or was that something else?
So I think the way, and again, this is just from, I guess, the handbook provided by UW Extension, is that, so the idea that the purpose of the sign ordinance becomes unduly burdensome in order to comply. So if the purpose is to, for example, like, one of them is eliminate distractions for pedestrians and motorists, preserve and improve the appearance, and then to by regulating the design area, number, construction, location of signs. So is complying with the zoning ordinance unduly burdensome in order to attain that purpose? I guess if that makes sense.
Can you take a preserve appearance?
Yeah, so like aesthetics, so like why we don't allow like signs wherever and however many you want is often.
Does
argument for many things.
aesthetics also, I mean, can scale fall into aesthetics?
Yeah, so that's why we are able to regulate, like design area number, and we have limits on how much of a facade can have signs. The sign ordinance itself doesn't have any kind of consideration, I guess, for scale of a building.
But the sign ordinance does say 10%,
Yeah,
and we are at less than half of 1% on this 30-inch letter.
And the
So.
10% doesn't apply to this.
No, I understand, but it certainly is going to apply to our neighbor across the street. They're allowed up to 10% up to 150 square feet of total signage. So if Sub-Zero elects to have one sign, it could be 150 square feet as long as it does not exceed 10%. And I understand that we've got two different criteria here, but what I'm saying is the standard Fitchburg code says that a sign can take up to 10% of a facade. And actually, we're probably less than what I'm showing because
You're only counting the
I'm
wood,
only counting the wood,
not the
not the
concrete.
entire facade of the building.
Well, we have a motion and a second. I think we better get that voted and then see where we go from there.
do a roll call vote?
I think so, definitely.
Sure. So, Dan Crowley,
Aye, yes.
Matthew
Grant.
Holda,
No.
Craig Stevenson,
No.
Julia Potter,
No.
Ron Buchholz. Right, so motion fails to pass.
I think we're,
So then we have to make a,
Motion to deny and that's why.
yeah.
all right. That won't come from me.
So moved. I'll second that motion.
So I think you might have to explain prior to that motion why you think it doesn't meet those three tests. So an explanation.
All right, well, just speaking for myself, I mean, obviously I can understand why it's, like a hardship, but I just, whether it comes up to the standard of unnecessary and unreasonable, like, well, some of the other members of the board have said, I mean, there are like other options possible. It's not like there's going to be like no signage. We're going to have a 40 square foot sign, catering to the people in the northbound lanes who will be able to see. And then people coming, southbound, will be depending on the monument signs anyway. And so I just don't know that it meets that standard, that one criterion. And I'm sort of babbling here, but, I'm sorry?
That's sufficient.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, because it has to meet all three, so if it doesn't meet one, then that's
Right.
sufficient. Okay. And we can do a roll call vote.
I think so.
Dan?
No.
Matt?
Yep.
Craig?
Yes.
Julia?
Yes.
Ron?
No.
All right, motion passes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you all for your time. Thank you.
We need a motion to adjourn.
I think we need a motion
Sunny
to, well, let me,
Just
send it
maybe one
down.
other thing,
Not
just
quite.
based on the agenda.
Oh.
I'll just go back to the agenda really quick. So, the work from department, I wanted to know one thing, since we're all in the same room right now, is that we did get another administrative appeal application for the zoning board of appeals just today. and it is for actually an appeal to a decision by our building inspector. So I just thought maybe since we were all here, I wanted to see what your availability was for a meeting. So with some requirements for getting departmental comments and making sure we have our public hearing notices, I was looking at that first week of February. So I think it's the 3rd through the 7th.
I'm bringing mine up.
I'm not available Thursday afternoon, but every other day works for me.
Do you need to hear from me since I'm here?
So I think maybe just in case, I don't know if the vacancy will be filled. I mean, it's better to have a,
Yeah, I'm fairly open that week.
okay. And not to hold anyone to it, just so I
Yeah.
get it on everyone's radar.
Yeah, would it be around the same time?
Yeah, at 4:30
Yeah,
works.
right now it looks like each of those days works, except for probably Friday, but.
Yeah, we won't do
And
Friday.
if it matters for me, the 6th is, Thursday is the least available.
Okay. Yeah, seems like earlier in the week seems to work
Yeah,
better.
right now I'm pretty much wide open, so.
I'm available.
Right, so look for another meeting notification and another staff memo, and it'll be a little bit different since it's, even though it's from building inspection, the Board of Appeals still handles those kinds of appeals, so it'll be a little different from what I think we're used to,
All
but
right.
that's all I have.
How
so-
exciting.
So what is it?
We need a motion to adjourn.
Oh, so moved.
Second.
I don't think we have, voice vote. Aye.
Aye.